Jeff, thanks very much for joining us today.
Yeah.
Well, let's start off by asking, what's something you find interesting about resilience?
All right. So with resilience, I think what I find probably most interesting with resilience is actually the impact that the way or style that people are resilient, how they're resilient, actually impacts other people around them. So for example, I've seen how resilience and the approach that people take to being resilient and through that process can make or break a team in a work environment, can make or break a family. And at the same time, I've seen how personally it can motivate me to change my behavior or to go out of my way to pick my level up pick my game up in the approach that I use based on the situation. So how I act.
So that's interesting, because so you're seeing a direct connection between an individual resilience and other people's behavior?
Yeah. So
how does that play out? I mean, like, to give us an example.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, kind of how I break down resilience with this example and how I view it is kind of there's an internal element of resilience, an individualistic side of things. So it's that individuals, how they're resilient and how they internalize it and the behaviors and traits that come along with that. But then I also think within the same individual, you can have a more of an external resilience. And that is kind of how your resilience, the approach that you take to being resilient, can impact those around you. And to kind of build on that, you have individuals that I've seen in work environments, and that's my background, that they may get stressed in work environments. So something comes up, a project deadline or something like that. And there's those individuals that will kind of they've used coping skills where they bring those around them and they say, all right, socially, let's all work together, find a way to get through this and drive through and use that approach to be very resilient and get through the project. Yeah. Whereas on the other hand, I've seen individuals that go very internal and they say, I have to do this, everyone get out of my way. Project still gets done. Right. At the end of the day, the client still sees the same potential outcome in a positive way. So they're both, in essence, depending on where you're standing, have been resilient in the situation. But it's about how they've gone about the resilience process. That one motivates and can build and impact others in a positive way, right, and the other can do it potentially in a negative way.
So in your work, which has been focused largely on organizational psychology, really, hasn't it, and how teams function and how people lead,
yep,
what you're seeing is the almost like the variable is how the individual practices their resilience.
Yeah, yeah. So in our world, oftentimes, or particularly some companies I've worked for in the selection side of things, so when they're selecting, hiring for resilience, because in the work environment, it's extremely important, as pretty much most environments, but we're having individuals that are resilient or have the ability to be resilient in order to continue to work together effectively, but also create positive outcomes together. So, I mean, in that environment, in the work environment, I'm seeing oftentimes a misunderstanding of resilience from the standpoint of we often look at just the concept, well, are they resilient? Have they gotten things done in the past? Are they able to cope? But a lack of understanding of how they get there through their resilience approach. So whether or not they're taking those around them with them or they're going on it on their own.
So you could have two people who could be, if we could measure it, which we can't, but they could have the same resilience score, but one person will be more productive in a team context than another person.
Yeah, potentially.
Because of the way in which they manage their resilience.
Yes, and that's and it's also about how they feed off others, and I feel like that's part of resilience, is that adapting to others around you through the resilience process.
So I could draw from someone else in my team if I'm being productive and looking after my resilience. That will help my resilience as well as help the resilience of the team?
Yeah.
Okay. But at the same time, I could also draw something from the team for my resilience that actually was negative impact on the team.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So I see how both those could definitely play.
So I could still come out of it resilient, but it could be on a cost-benefit analysis. It could be in one scenario, it could be a negative, and in another scenario, it could be a positive.
Yes.
For others around.
Yeah, for others around you. So that's how I definitely see it from those two vantage points.
So do people learn how to do this, or is this something that you've seen? I mean, can people change? Have you seen in the work that you've done how people can change the way in which they manage their resilience?
Yeah. So I mean, I think from a resilient standpoint, I think definitely at the heart of it, it's innate, and we can discuss that later. Or what have you. But I mean, with regard to the work environments, I've definitely seen. So I've been on all levels of it. I've hired for resilience. I've trained resilience, and within leadership, and then I've also understood cultures of resilience and trying to build up a culture of resilience.
Right.
So from the training standpoint, I definitely think there's resilience is, all of us are resilient. It's on a spectrum of resilience personally. So I think where you are and how you get to be on a higher end of resilience and the ability to really cope positively and bring those with you.
Right.
I think that can be you can train that. You can train elements of emotional stability. You can work on anxiety levels. How you basically, not necessarily how that affects you, but how you manage it. And that's a big part of the training of the resilience, is how you manage it and cope with it throughout.
Is there a connection between how people use their resilience and personality type, or is it kind of independent of that?
So how a couple organizations that I work for find resilience as, in the most simplistic terms, when you're hiring from a personality standpoint, is you look at emotional stability and anxiety.
Right.
And the theory is, and I don't have the paper on me now or the reference on me now, but it's around looking at how individuals that are high anxiety and low emotion are often, it's assumed, to be less likely to be resilient than those that are highly emotionally stable and low anxiety.
Okay.
Because that's the concept of, with those two dynamics working together, it's that an individual that can manage, and this is all outside of coping, but this is the personality. Before you, if you understand that about yourself, then
right.
you can cope with it. But that level of, if I'm always going to be keep my anxiety done, I'm not getting too worked up about anything, and I'm pretty low anxious, but I'm also emotionally stable, so I'm well aware about who I am, how I'm impacting others around me. Then those two combined, you're likely to be able to get through situations positively, keep a cool, calm head, and be more resilient than those that are on the
There's quite a lot of insight and awareness in that. Then you're talking about self-awareness
Yes.
of the way in which I live and behave myself, but also awareness of how I impact the behaviours of others and the context, the culture that I'm around.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're training for self-awareness and insight?
Yeah, so I mean, with the actual training, there's that awareness. So that's oftentimes when we would do training around leadership, if resilience would be a part of it. You need to understand kind of where you are in this personality spectrum,
right.
That's the traits that are often related to resilience, and then understand that about yourself. But ultimately, we would always come down to is there's only so much of that innate personality that you can change. It's really about how you manage that within yourself, but also within those around you.
Right.
And for example, some of the training that when I was working with leaders was around them not understanding why they couldn't get their team to buy into a project that they had, for example.
Right.
And oftentimes it was that they were using an approach that was very similar to who they naturally were, as opposed to taking time to learn about who the other individuals were. And so I started seeing that with the resilience side of things. Starting to look at, or have to start looking at, when the pressure's on, am I just going innately into myself and I'm going to get through it, as opposed to I'm going to take time to reflect on how others need to get through this. And that's that more external resilience side of things that I see is often missed in describing and explaining resilience.
This is a little bit out of that field, but I was just thinking, the way in which you describe teams working seems to be the way in which we'd expect a high-functioning Western team to work.
Yep.
Does this work cross-culturally as well, do you think, in your experience, or is resilience connected to culture and context as well?
So my view of resilience is really that all of us are, whether we like it or not. Our bodies naturally, for example, are resilient entities. So you have a virus, you get sick, your body will naturally at some point overcome that, and I mean, ideally. And
I surely hope so.
Yeah, yeah, and cope. And then go and move on, get back to its natural form, or however you want to describe it. You smoke 100 cigarettes, and your lungs will get beat up for a little bit, but if you stop smoking those cigarettes, your body will naturally heal itself back up. and get back to that natural form. So our bodies are naturally, and your skin, you know, you you go out in cold weather or the sun, you burn it, it'll heal itself. And we can't help ourselves from being resilient. Same with mentally, I think, and I think we're naturally born to, I tie resilience to survival, is that it's getting and taking that step forward. How well you do it, and whether, again, you bring others along with you, or you just do it for yourself, or it's the perfect outcome or just an okay outcome. The fact is you're resilient on some level. So talking about cross-culturally, I don't think it necessarily is described exactly the same, or how we get there is the same. You look at hierarchical structure systems in businesses, and some of them really thrive in maybe culturalistic societies, or and thrive better in individualistic societies as opposed to collective societies. But that's just one way to get to the end means of being a good business or getting business done. How people get there, I think, can be different. But I think at the end of the day, there's this individual way of getting there, and the collective way of getting there.
And presumably those would combine in a sense that you're almost talking about there being an evolutionary focus on resilience individually, but there's also, obviously, because we can't live by ourselves as individuals, we need community, that there's a resilience in terms of social grouping as well, like families, tribes, cultures, contexts. So it benefits my resilience individually to be able to work closely with you or with others who are in my social group. And so there's a payoff for us as a community to be resilient as well.
Yes. And to kind of build on that and tie into your last question as well, I just was thinking of an example of a way that when I was traveling around Haiti, which is a lower income country where people don't often have, at least from where I'm from in the States, is more affluent as far as financially is concerned, where you would buy, for example, a flashlight. And so to walk around at night, I may naturally say, I need a flashlight to walk around, just because that's what I've gotten used to doing. So I'm using that to be resilient and walking around at night. Whereas some of my friends that I was traveling with in Haiti would use other avenues of being able to walk through the forest, either more reliant on the natural lights, or would use reflection from cars and wait and travel that way. So, or reflection from lights around them, or things like that. They'd use a different approach. So that all tied into, one time I was talking to a friend about the difference of how we act as humans and depending on where you're from, and my friend used the example of a internal approach to survival and an external. So he said oftentimes people that come from more westernized, where they have more money, they'll often buy something to allow them to adapt to the environment that they're around, whereas people that don't necessarily have those financial means will use either what's around their current situation and what's around their environment, or rely more on themselves internally to manage the situation or get a better feel for the land or things like that. So I kind of see that as a difference to your original question around resilience and culture, or that's less culture necessarily than financial.
So if I was to take a stark contrast between, say, a very wealthy context where people might live more individualistic lives compared to a very financially poor community where they don't have much in the way of possessions, but they have a lot in the way of relationships.
If you want to bring it to like tying it into basically how, that goes back into how you survive or how resilient you are based on the culture or community around you. So I think oftentimes if it's more of a traditional individualistic approach where you're sitting and saying I can do it, it's all on me, and you're less likely to rely on others than someone that comes from a background that says no, when times are tough you rely on those around you to get through it.
If we were to try and strive for a universal measure of resilience, which is impossible, but hey, why not? If I can, in my Western culture, if I have the financial ability to buy the things that I think are going to help me be resilient, and you tried to measure my resilience against this universal measure compared with those who had lots and lots of very strong interpersonal relationships, is there a way of saying that me with my wealth and my possessions is actually less resilient than the person who has lots of strong interpersonal relationships?
No, so for me, I'm pretty, I would say, kind of move away from the science of psychology and even the operational definition and how we define resilience to personally, I feel like resilience is something that there is not a better or worse or more or less technically, because everyone is coming from a different background of where you started. So someone that maybe, if you start putting, like, there were some studies done on children and some of the earlier studies in resilience about children that came from abusive families, and they said at the end of the day, 1/3 of the children went on to have, they said, successful businesses and lives, and the other 2/3 ended up falling down in the alcohol abuse and abusive path as their parents. So they basically were saying, and to some degree, how I kind of interpret it is that they 1/3 were more resilient than the others.
Right.
So how I kind of disagree with that is that, and same with trying to put that like more or less resilient term on things, is that those individuals that were the 1/3 that came through, who knows what other avenues and other elements they were given from people around them to make them that resilient. Whereas, say, of those 2/3, they were given less than that and still became, maybe they were still abusive, but did something else great in their life.
Right.
Where there's no real even barrier on what you're given to make you more resilient. So I think the process of resilience is different, and how we are resilient, how we each as individuals get through something. But when you start comparing resilience of individuals or communities or whatever, I think it's very hard to start putting that definition down or that descriptor down to who's more resilient. I think it's more of who, as the individual, I would say ultimately comes down to, do you feel you're more resilient almost?
No, I think that's fair, because what you're really saying in pure scientific terms is that there's too many variables to be able to isolate in any kind of scientific design to come up with something that's verifiable in comparing between individuals or between groups.
Yeah, because I think pretty much you could say that with most any situation, but I think with resilience, I would say the hardest thing is to create a definable outcome that makes resilience good, bad, or less or more is the hardest thing to do with resilience, probably.
One of the things I've noticed about resilience is it seems to be something that's defined after the event, in the sense of, I prove I'm resilient because I have got to where I am, rather than I have resilience, now I'm going to go and do this thing. And so it seems to be, whenever you have a kind of a context or a definition that's related to events that have occurred previously, you can kind of get to wherever you want to, really.
That's a great point.
So in a sense, what you're talking about is a qualitative value of resilience rather than a quantitative one. Is that correct?
Yeah. I would definitely describe it more. And again, a lot of this has been, thinking that's not too well developed, but more of kind of, as I take a step back and start reflecting more on resilience, really is kind of what is that resilience, and using that.
So
approach.
What's the element of choice then in terms of, say an individual, let's take an individual in the context that best, organisations and organisational context. What's the choice that an individual team member makes about how they manage themselves? That's going to be a positive thing for them to do, and then for their team in terms of resilience. Yeah,
I think that a lot of that comes down to self-awareness and communication. It really comes down to, with resilience, it's that if you are, for example, having a harder time, instead of necessarily, again, going to try and find something that will allow you to simply get through it, it's reflecting on, relying on your team more, I guess would be the best way to answer that. So communicate with them. This is harder for me. I need you to help pick me up here or there or whatever it may be. And then allowing the team to help build you up. So I think particularly a lot of the organizations I've worked with, on the corporate side of things, it's often in the context where I've worked, is that you don't want to show weakness. And oftentimes not showing weakness actually reduces resilience as an organization. And so, being vulnerable, those types of things that I think will really help individuals be more resilient as an individual, but also as a team.
And that would be similar then in a family context or in interpersonal relationships with significant others, is that it's something about your vulnerability or the acknowledgement of your vulnerability in that group context that is important.
Yes. So how I see that is that ultimately that takes a step back and starts building trust.
Right.
And with trust, you then start building more of a, I believe, a tighter connection with people.
Yeah.
And so then that tighter connection with people, actually then you start feeling closer to people. And through that closer connection with people, you may end up being willing to work harder for that individual or with that individual. So, I mean, take a full circle on that when the work environment or relationship environment, it's those types of things just kind of thrive on and build other elements that connect you to that individual, and then also give you the confidence to go back to the team environment, which is, could you put this in relationship environment from parenting side of things, but allowing the teammate or the team member or your team or your employee, whoever it may be, to take a chance and to maybe possibly fail. Because how I really feel a lot of resilience is that sometimes people, the way it's described, think maybe they're not resilient, or they don't have the ability to be resilient, or what have you, however that came about in their history or their past. But what I often found is that people that have made a mistake, or not, people that have gone through an experience where they had to be resilient, whether they wanted to or not, whether they came out on top or didn't do as well as they thought they were, the fact that they went through it, ultimately, for the most part, grew their ability to do it again. So it's the same thing with working with teams, is that if you do everything for everybody, or you try with your parenting skills not to let your kid get into too much trouble or too much, you want to coddle them and not let them make too many mistakes or feel too much adversity, then oftentimes that can actually, in my opinion, stifle resilience. So the same with a team or the family relationship. It's that sometimes people I think people need to go through it in order to build it up.
So we can be too protective in work context and in parenting context as well, and by keeping people isolated from risk, we're actually not helping them develop their resilience skills.
So resilience ultimately, I think, needs to be experienced. You need to be experience having to be resilient in order to be better, or not better, in order to improve the way how you are resilient.
There's there's that kind of phrase that we often talk about with teenagers, is that they're testing themselves against the world, and there's a very strong tendency in some parts of particularly in the Western world, to protect teenagers from the world, but they continue to seek ways of testing themselves, and you would see that then as part of the process of developing their individual resilience skills, is by seeing how they themselves survive in these things, and they go through it.
Hands down. And I think that's the same way good training is often done, is that you put an individual in an environment that they're not used to, not necessarily let them fail, but put them in a position where they either have to fail or dig deep to find something new about themselves in order to move forward, but ideally in a safe environment where it's there's not too many casualties, but it's that concept that's what's going to build that resilience throughout.
So failure is not negative in and of itself. From your perspective, failure is something rather that can teach me quite a lot about my own resilience, and I can learn from that because I've been through it, and it can actually be a benefit to me. What's the role of leadership then, if you've got a leader of a team? How does a leader, because we expect leaders to behave a little bit differently than other team members, but what does a leader do to help others in the team build resilience?
I think with the concept of resilience and how I've seen it is there needs to be an understanding of how, from the leader standpoint, who they're working with. So, for example, if you talk about how resilient people are, some people, and how people manage their process, or how resilient they are during the situation that they're going through, that leader needs to know his team or whoever he's working with. And I think that's the difference between an individual within a team needs to know who's around them, but they need to do, I think the leader needs to do more of managing those different personalities and working with them one-on-one, but also working with them on how they're going to, pairing people up, for example, that may feed positively off each other. So the leader's position's best set as a, I guess, directing and managing as the resilience. So he's putting the little pieces together and saying, all right, these two need to be together, these two need to be together, now we need to come together, then we need to break apart, type of thing, and to manage the situation. So
is it important for the leader to display vulnerability at times as well?
Oh yeah, so going back to that piece, I think again, I think this is totally different cross-culturally and environment, like depending on what your industry is. I think there are times that you don't necessarily want to see vulnerability from your leader. But for the whole in the corporate work environment, oftentimes I think the type of vulnerability you want to see is honesty and awareness of maybe I made a mistake, or maybe I'm not fully sure where we're going. I'm willing, but with that same vulnerability, you need to show confidence of, I know how we're going to get there. Right. So I think a leader can show vulnerability. I think that can build resilience, or it can't necessarily build resilience. It can build a connection with individuals that are going to likely then be more resilient as a team throughout. Because I think with that, ultimately, the leader's building an environment, a culture of resilience. So that means that he needs to be a part of it, and not just managing it, but constantly creating that culture around, let's feed off of each other, let's build off each other, let's be resilient together, but also do it in our own way.
Right. So it's an intentional thing on the part of a good leader is to look at their own resilience, their own vulnerabilities, their own experiences, but also to examine the team and see how resilient they are, and then work towards building that resilience through experience.
Yes, level of where each individual is how each individual is doing throughout, whether it's a deadline, or if there's a potential crisis in the work environment, or even if they're merging with another organization, or just depending on the situation, they have to know ideally where everyone's at and keep their finger on the pulse, kind of thing, as well. Now, to what you said,
we talked a little bit about choice before. There are some team leaders who seem to be unable to make the choice to either examine their own vulnerability or build their own resilience and be interested in others. What do you do if you're a member of a team where the leader just seems to be totally disengaged and doesn't care? Is that damaging your own resilience, or is that part of what you said before, the experience of building?
I think at the end of the day, when we're interviewing people and or being interviewed, people often want us to reflect on a time that was tough and how we got through it. And I think, kind of my advice to anyone that's in a bad work environment, such as the one you described, it's number one, that sucks. But number two, this is a great opportunity, as long as it's not damaging your reputation, to learn from and use it as a great example that you'll be able to tell stories of in the future. So I think it can really help build your resilience. At the same time, so much of that I think comes down to, it can also hurt some people's resilience, meaning that it can become so damaging that it's a waste of time that doesn't allow you to focus on yourself, that you're constantly having to deal with that in situations.
So potentially there are contexts that are so toxic that really the only safe thing you can do is actually get out of it. And that's okay. You would see that as that's not defeat. That's a recognition of reality.
Definitely, because I think it's one of those things. It's that you gotta know when to hold them, know when to fold them. So it's one of those things. It's like, if you're in that environment, you could fight it, and that may be part of how you end up, working through the project and becoming resilient. Working through the negative situation. But at the same time, sometimes it's best to take a step back and get out of it. And other times, what can happen is people get so bogged down in what's going on around them that they lose focus of actually being resilient. And they may have gotten the leader fired or made their point, but at the end of the day, the main goal of what they were trying to do actually didn't help them, but also didn't help those around them. And they were probably, if it was described in operational terms, less resilient in the outcomes than had they taken a step back and walked away.
So you do connect resilience with outcomes, don't you?
Ultimately, I try not to, meaning that I don't think you can help from doing it, but as far as, it's hard to put a universal outcome on it, let's say,
But generally speaking, you see a connection between outcomes and resilience.
And at the end of the day, resilience, the term itself, if you're using it, is going to link into some end game, which is their end outcome.
So it's not just a thing in and of itself. It's always going to be connected with how we live our life, or how we achieve our objectives, or how we get on with other people, or how we do well in our job.
I think it always gets defined that way. It always, at the end of the day, resilience itself. That's why I think resilience is so universal. It can have our bodies are resilient, and we're resilient in teams. The ecosystem's resilient. Like the resilience itself, but I think you need to put some kind of outcome to be able to discuss it outside of a very philosophical what is resilience type.
Right, yeah. If it's so philosophical in the sense that it might have meaningless for most people.
Yeah.
Well, in contexts where by their nature they're competitive, you know, there are some jobs where individual competition is really important in terms of progress through the organisational. How do you build your own resilience without seeking for ways to beat everybody else in the organisation?
Well, one, I think that beating others may be an approach that's okay and works for individuals. So I think that taking that approach can work, and people could still then be considered resilient. But I think that at the end of the day, to go to what I think you're alluding to, is that individuals need to understand how they're getting where they're going. Okay. And at the end of the day, you can be so mad when times are tough that if you don't stop and reflect on where am I trying to go, who am I trying to bring with me, and you just react, then it could be very damaging to those around you. So I think there's always an option of I can do this on my own, beat everyone, get there, break it, burn every bridge, but at the end of the day, I'm at the top of the mountain. But at the same time, is that the approach you want to take? And that's how some leaders I've worked with said, I mean, I've done with leadership development. I've talked to them and I said, you know, who do you want to be in the organization? How do you want to get there? And they said, I'm going to get there however I have to, whatever it takes. And for them, that often means it's more important to just go instead of taking time to bring people with them. And they're okay with that. But I mean, I personally believe that whatever it is, you have to stop and take time and stop and reflect and saying, through this process, how am I getting there? And especially when things are tough, how resilient, and what's my approach to resilience through this?
So if we were talking before just on the individual case of resilience, we could say that a person who decided at the beginning of their career they were going to be the CEO of the company, however, whatever it took to get there, and they got there, and they made it, and everyone in the company either disagrees with them or hates them. It doesn't really matter because they've got to where they're going. Their own internal resilience is still strong from that measure, from where they wanted to be.
I would say if you say that person get through adversity, if they get through adversity, how they did it, they screwed everyone around them, but they made it through. At the end of the day, they were resilient in nature of getting through and came out positive. If we look at it from that definition, then they did it. But that's a very when I say internal, that means that it only got them there. There wasn't that.
And if we looked at the resilience of the company that they lead, it might not be as strong as it could have been if they'd been.
Hands down. I mean, I think
because the risks to the company now are quite strong because there's this whole context of whatever it is that's got there, toxic conflict. So you could do things that assert yourself resilience at expenses of everybody else, but that may have a follow-through effect in terms of resilience of the communities which you.
Yes, exactly. That's what I said. At the beginning, I've seen the way how you are resilient can make a family, break a family, make a team, break a team, and it's.
So there's quite a lot of choices then involved in this, really, aren't there? I mean, I could choose, for example, to say, okay, I'm going to go for the top job, but I'm going to take my best friends and family with me. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time working on those relationships so that we are together, we get through that. And then, or I can, but I'd be aware of that. I'd think that through and say, okay, what is it that's needed?
And I think, because I think that's really, once you start identifying that, that's going to tie into how you cope. And I think coping is a huge part of resilience when times are tough. So if I'm coping and I'm saying, at the end of the day, I'm doing this with those around me in mind, for example, or my family in mind, then you may react differently than if you said, I don't give a shit about anyone else around me. I'm getting there. My family can, it's the fastest man that makes it. That's going to change, I think, the way that you cope and how the type of, I say type, and again, this is something newer that I'm thinking, a degree of resilience or type of resilience, still working on that. But
like a personality type, or
well, when I say really type, it's like
or categories of.
Well, when I say type, it's like a resilience where I view things from solely my perspective, versus I view things from a solely external or community perspective. Right. I would say personally, because of where I grew up or whatever, or who I am now, every decision I make, I think about people around me for the most part. And that is just kind of how I am. I have friends and know people that they're much more focused on themselves in that environment and how it works for them. Better or worse, I'm not saying either of those two, I'm just saying who I am. And so it's kind of, I do see when times are tough, the type of resilience I kind of call it is I don't know how else to describe it really.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense to me. I was thinking too, both of us have been to Haiti, and one of the things that struck me about Haiti, as with other post-disaster contexts, is that the family seems to be the core unit that's left in a context where everything else is broken down, and people will do things for their family resilience, regardless of what else is going on around them. It was almost as if this is it. There's nothing else left for me to do. Is only the family left, so I'll do whatever it takes to make sure my family is okay.
Yep.
And they seem to be somehow more resilient than those who are left totally on their own, as individuals, to be able to cope with these kind of devastating things.
Yeah.
So there's.
I agree with that. Yeah. As far as I think the concept of us as humans with resilience is that, and again, to me, it kind of also ties into survival. Is that I think we are naturally, whatever culture, wherever you're from, are social beings. So I think anytime you put us in healthy social environments, we're going to thrive more so than a loner in the woods.
Right.
That being said, there are people that do thrive better as a loner in the woods, but I say as the majority of people, we're going to most likely thrive in those environments where there's that support to be able to bounce ideas off. And
the loner in the woods is a really interesting example, because it would seem to me that on the kind of the framework that you're suggesting, the loner in the woods is only a human loner. He's not a loner from everything that's going around in the woods. He's got to be totally aware of his environment, and somehow has to have formed some kind of resilient relationship with the woods, whether they're the animals or the trees or whatever it is, the water supply, in order to be resilient, in order to be strong. So it's still he's made a choice about the types of relationships he's going to be resilient with. It just happens to be not a human relationships, but it's still others.
Definitely. I can
so we can see those examples of people who survive for a long time on their own in the wilderness, and those who die within 24 hours because they have no idea how to form a relationship with the woods.
Putting it
or they're
from that
terrified of
perspective.
So again, though, it seems to be that what you come back to, and I'm going to finish up fairly soon, but it seems to be that and tell me if I'm wrong on this, but there's a core component to the way you're thinking about resilience to do with self-awareness, my personal insight about who I am and how I look after myself, and choices about what I do. So it's not something that resilience is not something that just merely happens to me. It's something rather that I can choose to do a lot with and about.
Yes,
would that be fair?
I think that, and I also think there's elements of I think oftentimes we get in our own way. To go back to what I was saying from the beginning with our bodies, naturally we're all resilient. So I do think we're making choices to how or the type of resilience to put it in terms that still aren't fully well developed, but the type of resilience, you're making that choice of how you're going to potentially cope in environments or cope with situations. And that isn't always something that you completely choose. I think there are innate elements of how you get there. But even the concept of us just waking up every morning and taking a breath, that we can't control that. But to me, that's part of our natural body's ability to be resilient. And so I put that in, is that you do have no choice over that part of it. So you're constantly, your body's trying to make you, they're waking up every day and breathing. It's trying to give you a chance to be resilient or continue to be resilient. And so that side of it, I don't think we have a choice. But then once you get up and you start walking around, then you're starting to make the choices of how am I going to be resilient.
So in a sense, you're almost saying we've already got an advantage in the sense that our bodies, our physical and possibly even our psychological
tied into that,
is tendency towards keeping on going and staying alive and thriving. And then we can build on that, or we can make stupid decisions and chop away at that.
And then as far as how you work with others in work environments or family, whatever, you have the chance to, as leaders and family members and teams, to help individuals continue to take the next step and thrive, or you have the ability to push them down and keep them from getting up. So I think there's that big part of it. Yeah.
That's a really great and interesting perspective, Jeff. I'd love to keep on talking with you, but we're going to have to call this to a halt. But look, thanks very much for talking with me today, and we'll do this again sometime.
Great, no problem. Thank you.